Good afternoon and welcome to our weekly media briefing and public health update with Montgomery County Executive Mark Elrich. I'm Lorna Virgili, Hispanic Public Information Officer, and joining us today from the Department of Health and Human Services is Dr. James Bridgers, Director, as well as Mr. Sean O'Donnell, Assistant Chief of Public Health Services. Dr. Earl Stoddard, who is the Assistant Chief Administrative Officer, is also joining us. And our special guest today is Chris Conkling, Director for the Montgomery County Department of Transportation. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Mr. County Executive, the floor is yours.
Yes, I'm sorry I'm late. I could get neither of my computers to work, which was rather startling. So I'm doing this on a combination of an iPad and an iPhone. See how this goes. Thank you all for being here today. Like, I don't know if anybody around here has ever appreciated 30-degree weather more than we have. Last week, it brought Arctic air and temperatures far below what we are used to. I can't remember the last time we were dealing with days where the wind chill was below zero. And I know this has made it hard in so many ways for so many people. There was something last week in the storm out of all this that was actually positive. And that's that Pepco and the other providers only had a few outages, and basically the lines held up. And I know that in the lead up to the storm, people were talking about how the sleet was going to bring down power lines and the kind of problem that was going to cause on the infrastructure. And the good news is very few power lines went down. So on top of everything else that happened, at least we did not have a major power outage. This is certainly not something we can take for granted. And over many years, many of our neighboring jurisdictions and us worked with Pepco to do more and get them to be more proactive about tree pruning, but also to strengthen their lines. And, you know, I've seen it, and I think other people have noticed it. On many of the lines in the county, Pepco's wrapped heavy metal wire around the line, and that has made it the lines much more resilient in the event of events like this, even in the event of branches falling on the lines. So that was one good piece of news that came out of the storm. The hazard of this storm has been the amount of sleet that came down with the snow and instantly turned everything to ice. Residents and others were calling this icecrete. And our county weather expert, Matt Mazurko, testified yesterday to the council that this storm had been entirely snow. We would have likely had about 20 inches of snow. I guess it's hard to say if we were lucky. But if this were just snow, even over 20 inches, our job to clearing it would have been a lot easier. We still would have had to find places to put stuff, but the snow would have been much more easily pushed. Residents could have cleared their sidewalks, even though you would have spent a lot of time shoveling. But many things would have been different than they were. And that, you know, but that didn't happen. Regular snow shovels didn't work with this ice. I saw people were sending me pictures of their snow shovels, and their snow shovel blades were completely bent and mangled because they were trying to chop through the ice with those, I guess they're aluminum shovels basically, and they just didn't cut it. Myself, I had to go out and take one of my garden spades that had a big steel blade on it, and I was able to break through the ice. And, you know, the sad part was that I broke through the top 3 inches of it. Everything underneath was nice, light, fluffy snow. So once I had finished chopping everything up and throwing away all the ice, I was able to shovel the rest of the snow away. But people on their sidewalks often weren't that lucky. And, you know, I know the snow shoveling on our sidewalks has really lagged behind. And it has been really hard to order people to go out there in 5-degree, 8-degree weather with zero wind chill factor and say you have to get your snow shovel by the next day. This challenges us in many ways. We've not been challenged before. We had, you know, this approach of plowing one side of the street so people could dig out and move their cars to the other side. That didn't work because when people went out to dig out, they discovered that the snow in the street against their car or in their driveway wasn't snow anymore, but it was ice. And you just could not break those ice chunks up with a regular snow shovel. I still see cars that are packed into snow. And this is probably the longest I've seen cars buried, as somebody said, in this little snow. I had somebody write me and say, I don't understand how you couldn't possibly have moved 8 inches of snow. And the problem was if this had been 8 inches of snow, it would have been moved. They would have done one pass, they would have done a second pass, and another 3 inches, and we'd be pretty much done with this. But that's not the way it happened. Ice was a very different animal. And, people said, well, what could you have done differently? And I'd say that, it's hard to say what you do differently operationally since the ice came pretty fast and pretty thick. The county would need very different equipment, more like people have in more northern cities, to deal with the snow that we don't have here. We're not we don't have a lot of front loaders that can shovel up snow, clear driveways, put it in dump trucks. We don't have enough dump trucks. We don't have the kind of fleet that you would normally have to deal with snow at this level. And I'll say every jurisdiction around us is stuck in the same place. I just noticed that, BWI airports opened yesterday. They've fixed the runways. So this has been challenging. Fairfax County kids were delayed 2 hours, just like our kids were. We've had throughout this region the same problems. Prince George's County, Fairfax, and the Virginia counties. I was talking to people in Annapolis. They were telling folks not to come down to Annapolis because the streets are completely snowed in. There's no place for people to park. Residents who got their cars out put their cars in the garage. So the streets are unparkable and the garages are full. So that's the kind of stuff that we're dealing with throughout the region. I hope that people recognize this was not the typical storm. This wasn't snow that we weren't able to move. This was the real problem with all the ice that came down. And with that, I would like to turn it over to Chris Conklin to provide you with the latest updates on our snow and ice removal processes. And Chris, thank you for being here. And also, I want you to make sure you thank the folks in your department because your folks work tirelessly and are still working to get this mess out of here. And I just want you to know I appreciate the challenge you're up against.
Thank you. And you were supposed to be greeted with Richard Dorsey today, who's more charming than I am, but he's still dealing with snow and ice operations, so I had to cancel today, and I'm here instead. What we're working with today is primarily clearing county-maintained sidewalks, crosswalk locations, and intersections. I've got to say this work continues to be extremely challenging. The snow and ice is softer today, which is helpful. We have warmer temperatures yesterday and today. And if you have been watching these ice mountains, they are probably a third to a half the size they were earlier in the week, just from evaporation and some melting that has occurred with the salt embedded in that ice and the warmer temperatures. Those crews are out there today on our major roads primarily, and they are contending with lots of traffic. If you've been driving around Montgomery County, you know it's been difficult. There are half lanes missing on many of the major roads. The State Highway Administration has been out each day clearing those streets to their full width, but the intersection conditions continue to be challenging. So our crews are out there today, and they have to be out there with extensive traffic management and traffic protection to keep the crews safe from errant drivers or people not paying attention or trying to get around these clearing operations in unsafe ways. So that work is slow and difficult. And I really ask everybody to continue to exercise patience and care when driving and recognize these crews are out there trying to make the situation better for you, but it will be worse while they're actually doing that work. So please take extra caution. Also, our schools have been back open for the last 2 days. We thank Montgomery County Public Schools for their efforts to get their sites cleared and to coordinate with us to get critical items addressed for them so that they can operate. But conditions are not perfect on this network. We have lots of issues with snow at school bus stops, snow on sidewalks. And please, just like with our workers, pay extra care when you're driving and you see school buses traveling with students in those areas and people waiting for or getting off school buses as they may not have a clear path to walk. That brings me to my other major point for today. It is now time, if you have not already, to clear your own sidewalk. The snow and ice is softer today than it has been for several days. We've been advised by the public schools of issues with major bus stops that are buried in snow. Moving that snow is the responsibility of the owner of the adjacent property almost all the time. If you're not moving that snow, you're creating risks for people that are walking on those sidewalks and potential risks for people accessing school buses or transit buses. The conditions are better, and you have an opportunity to get out there during the daylight hours while the conditions are warmer, the ice and snow is softer, and do the best you can to clear those places for people to wait or people to walk. I do understand that the Department of Housing and Community Affairs has begun issuing notices of violation and will be following up with citations for locations where no effort has been made to address those conditions. We are doing similar work in the locations that the county is responsible for snow removal. But as I mentioned, our focus has been on and will continue to be on intersection clearing and clearing the ramps to and from sidewalks, the median openings for sidewalks, and larger bus stops where people are struggling to get through the snow to bus stops. Much of that work has been done before today, but as we and the other agencies who maintain streets continue to move the snow out of the travel lanes, we have to revisit a lot of that work ourselves, as any property owner, unfortunately, is aware of when you've done some work to clear snow and ice and that snow and ice gets redeposited. You have the unfortunate experience of having to do it again, but that's what we all have to do to keep the network safe. Our network is largely open and operational. There are not, aside from increased traffic congestion because of narrower streets and need for extra care because of still some blocked pedestrian facilities, we're able to function as a community much as we normally do. So thank you, County Executive, for the thanks to our crews. They have been working now in response to this weather event for 14 straight days. They were all grateful that we did not have to move into a county-wide salting operation last night with the call off of the precipitation that we were expecting. We are looking at potentially some more snow and ice of not a significant amount, but things that will require additional mobilization, possibly heading into the weekend. So they'll be ready for that. And if they're not responding to new snow and ice, they'll be continuing to work to clear up the network as best they can. So thank you.
Thank you, Director Conkling.
So, Chris, I have a question before we turn to other questions.
Absolutely.
And so, I've been talking to people about, well, you should have different equipment. I mean, I've tried to think about this from the perspective of what would have to have been done differently. And am I wrong to think that we would have needed conceivably hundreds of loaders and hundreds of dump trucks in order to have moved the snow? Because the only way for the snow not to wind up on a corner, for example, or not to wind up clogging most of the intersection in order to leave a lane or two free, that snow would have had to have been put on trucks and hauled away. And that requires a different loader than a snowplow. And it requires serious dump trucks. And you can't just have a few, because you got to account for the time that it would take to fill a truck and then that truck to go to a place where it could safely dump snow. You couldn't dump on somebody's parking lot because that would keep them from opening, and you couldn't dump on school sites. So am I right to think this would be rather enormous undertaking in terms of money to buy the equipment if we were to?
You are right. So, with our response plan, part of our response plan is to account for the suitability of equipment. In the early phases of this snowstorm, we had every conceivable piece of truck-oriented equipment out there plowing. And all of that equipment was effective up until some point Sunday evening, where it started to freeze over, and the lighter weight plow trucks weren't really able to move that frozen over precipitation that well. So the medium and heavy duty, very large trucks that you see out there were required. As that precipitation continued to solidify Sunday into Monday, we actually started to deploy the loader equipment on Sunday night as well around hospitals and other public safety facilities. But to have moved all of that snow off the roads quickly, you would have needed, as you mentioned, an enormous fleet of hauling equipment to take it to dump sites and a very large contingent of loader equipment to move that snow into those trucks. Our largest trucks would still be able to plow it into piles, but then you need to pick it up and haul it. So In this region where we have storms like this every 6 to 10 years, which seems to be the frequency, we don't have the quantity of that type of equipment. But the pace would still be slow. I don't want to give the impression that even if we had an entirely different, more robust fleet, we would have been instantly through this. It still would have taken quite some time because the loading operation is much more time intensive than pushing to the side.
I was looking at some of the amounts of snow in some of these streets, and it was easy to picture that one block could have filled the dump truck.
Yes,
And
we had those operations going on all through the weekend and into this week where we were clearing streets near schools in particular to try to make sure there's enough space. And, you do fill up a truck pretty much in each block. So we did some calculations about the weight of snow and ice that fell on not just county streets, but all of the rights of way in Montgomery County. It was about 3 million tons of ice on our streets. So 3 million tons, it's hard to think about what that means. So in the research we were doing, an aircraft carrier is about 100,000 tons. So if you think about the size and weight of an aircraft carrier, it's 30 of those. It was 125,000 fully loaded semi-trailers of snow and ice. It was something like 25,000 coal carrying rail cars of snow and ice. So it's an enormous quantity and weight of material. Normally when we talk about snow and ice, we talk about the volume. It's this huge volume like you were describing if it had all been snow. In this case, the weight and the compactness and solidification of the material were the major challenges we had to deal with. And if anybody remembers high school chemistry, there's the conservation of matter idea. You can't create it or destroy it, but you can move it and change its phase. So normally in these events, we have the opportunity to melt this stuff. And we melt it, it flows off our streets, it flows into the storm drains, it flows through sand filters, it gets some level of treatment and makes its way into the rivers. That's not the case here. It fell and froze, there was no melting. So the only thing we could do was move it. We had no cooperation in trying to get it to melt and go away. It did evaporate some over the last few days, and the last 2 days it has started to melt. But normally that happens at the beginning of these storms, not the end.
yeah, that was my sense of this. And this would have been many millions of dollars to, first of all, just buy the equipment for a once every 5 or 6 year event.
More
Not
than
to
many
mention, how
millions.
would you mobilize another 1,000 drivers?
More than many millions. Many millions.
Tens of
Each piece of
millions?
equipment is probably half to $750,000. And then you've got to look at how if you're going to get any other use out of that equipment. If you're not, how do you keep it operational when it's not in use? So it's a big challenge to manage. And there's been other comparisons to places like Syracuse and Michigan.
Yeah.
And I grew up in Boston, and in Boston, snow clearing is different. But it happens all the time. Several times a year that you get use out of that equipment. That's just not the case here. So people make other investments based on what they need to make. And I just also have to say, in those environments, after the large snow events, the roads look largely like they do here today. There's still piles of snow and ice. There's still challenges with passage, but the functioning of the communities is different, and there's a better able of the community to cope with the disruption than we have when it's more infrequent.
Yeah. I was in Minneapolis in the winter and when it happened to be much snow on the ground, and the sidewalks were actually 3 feet of snow packed above the ground. So you were walking elevated, and then they chopped into the snow and the ice to let people walk down to bus stops. So even there, they weren't able to get the sidewalks clean. They just packed the snow and you walked on it.
Yeah.
But then they could count on it staying there all winter long, which
Correct.
is not what happens here.
And there's a lot of jurisdictions that rely on creating traction with sand rather than melting with salt.
Yeah.
Because they know it's just never going to get above that freezing point for a very extended period of time. But that's, again, different climate generally and different practices in how they manage the snow and ice.
And I mean, the one, I think, fixable thing that we take away from this is what happened with the snow tracker and with 311, where 311 forwarded it correctly to the operators. but then it also closed it out, which must have created confusion, because if you looked at the list of things that needed to be done, things that people had just called in, it seems to be simultaneously forwarded to an operator to remove and simultaneously closed out as having been done. And that's a software problem that we can fix.
We have more work to do to make sure we understand everything that happened, but from what we understand, those systems actually worked as they're designed. And we've got to address the way that they're designed, because the way that 311 system is designed is we're not supposed to take a service request until we've reached a certain level of completeness in the operation, because it's very likely that any service request we received, we would have addressed through the normal course of the operation.
Right.
However, the message that went out didn't explain that. It said the service request was closed. What it should have said is that your request was received, we're still in normal operation. If when we're done with that, you still have a problem, please submit another service request. So we've got to address that. And the other thing we have to address that you mentioned with the snow tracker is the snow tracker is an automated system. It tracks when routes are closed out as complete, but we need to reinstate in that process a review by a manager who can assess whether what the system is reporting is matching the reality the crews are telling us, and make sure that we adjust that so it doesn't say it's complete if it's not complete. And during the course of the storm, when you and I talked with this group, I think it was midweek last week, we mentioned that we took that down because it wasn't being reliable in terms of the systematic reporting matching the conditions on the ground. And we do have to do a little bit of work over the time between now and next snow season to adjust that system so that we have a little bit more validation of the automated results before we share those with the public.
Excellent. Gentlemen, let's open it up for questions from members of the media. I see hands are up already. Suzanne Pollack, Montgomery Community Media, go ahead, you're first.
Thank you, and thanks for all that you did, actually. I was just wondering, when I listen to you and others, it makes total sense that it was hard and the ice and everything. Why do you think so many council people are saying that you guys did a bad job or it wasn't done well?
It's good politics. It's election year, I challenge them to look at what we did and say, you should have done this differently, as if they would know. People mobilized. I mean, I was actually impressed. I think you were at the press conference we did. They had already pre-treated the streets. They had everybody mobilized and ready to go. We didn't skimp on crews. Nobody said, let's not have so many crews out here. Let's not mobilize the private companies. We mobilized every resource we had and could get our hands on to do this. And when the ice came, it changed the whole nature of this. And for people on the council not to recognize that the ice, fundamentally changed the nature of the storm, and not to look around them and at least say, wait, before we say you guys did something wrong, how come everybody else is closed? How come everybody else's streets look like our streets? That might have given them a perspective on how dramatically this was different than anything else. But apparently the people who talked like that weren't interested in actually some objective assessment of what we were dealing with. I stand by the work our crews did, and I stand by the mobilization that the team did. They did not treat this half-assed. They treated it as a serious problem, and they put the resources in play. The snow changed to ice, and that was paralyzing. And I'm sorry that it's true, and I wish I had a magical solution. Trust me, I was thinking about, can we find flamethrowers and go out and melt the ice with flamethrowers? It was like, what could we possibly do to deal with this? The tools we have are seriously limited, and I doubt if even in another jurisdiction that had equipment, you might have just wound up with accepting the snow on the ground and dealing with it because it's something that lasts for a long time there. They don't try to get down to bare pavement in Minneapolis or the bare sidewalks every time they get a snowstorm because they would never stop dealing with it. So I think our folks did a good job. I think you saw a lot of political acting.
Thank you.
Thank you. I just want to say one thing, Mr. Conklin. I happen to live near Holy Cross Hospital, and as much as we dug out every single time we were the plows came by, they dug us back in. But your driver was nice enough at one point, got out of his truck, walked up to us and apologized and said, this is the only way they can do it. And I hope you understand. And we really appreciated that, even though we still had to dig out again.
Oh, I absolutely appreciate the incredible frustration with that situation. And I do wish there was something we could do to avoid it. But as the driver told you, the snow has to go somewhere and it goes to the right. And the other thing I just mentioned is I read and received, I'm not going to respond to, I promise you, but I read and received thousands of individual residents' anxiety-filled emails about not being able to get out of their house. And that anxiety is real, and I don't want to minimize it, but it doesn't change, as the county executive said, what we're able to do to respond. And trust me, this organization did everything it could to get every resident freed from their home as quickly as possible. And those residents that had pressing immediate needs, we were able to refer those to our colleagues in HHS and to the 911 emergency response service so that they could get out if they had pressing medical or emergency needs.
Thank you, Suzanne. Jeannie Bixby, the banner. Good afternoon, Jeannie.
Good afternoon, Lorna. Thank you. Thank you all. Mr. Conklin, I just wanted to ask, MCPS, put out this letter basically defending themselves against some of the things that were said in the council meeting yesterday. In your purview, can you talk about a little bit of what the cooperation between MCDOT and the school system looked like within the past week?
Yeah, we've been, as the letter from MCPS says, and we said in the work session with the county council yesterday, we had regular coordination with MCPS on their needs. It's challenging to open the schools. I totally appreciate that. I think the bigger challenge is when we try to push the responsibility, or not necessarily the responsibility, but it is the responsibility for the outcome from agency to agency. And we're definitely trying to avoid that. I don't think schools wants to do that either. Our communication has been strong. We could have a better understanding of those critical needs earlier so that we can try to avoid further delays and disruptions to schools. And we could have a better understanding of how many different entities are involved in getting that public road network open. We're about 2/3 of the county road network, but the other third are municipalities, state highway administration, and private owners. And we don't have a lot of control over those elements, and the school system can work with all of us to try to make sure that all those critical needs are addressed. And in these sorts of events, we are never going to have conditions that allow operations like they are on an ordinary pleasant day in May. And everybody has to realize that there's got to be some flexibility and some adjustment to their operation to be able to continue as best you can through a challenging circumstance. And I think that's clear to everybody at this point.
Yeah, got it. That's very helpful. I just did want to follow up on something you said earlier, and I just wanted to clarify, make sure I'm understanding. Earlier, you were saying that some of the bus stops, and I'm referencing school stops, not necessarily ride-on, but that some of the complications may have been because people aren't clearing their personal sidewalks. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, the vast majority of sidewalk in this county is supposed to be cleared by the person who owns the property next to it. There's about 115 miles of sidewalk out of several thousand that the county maintains. And those bus stops are located generally on the sidewalk. So if the sidewalk's not clear, the school bus stop isn't clear. And that's part of the reason that there's the enforcement provisions in that code for the owner to go clear that sidewalk. It's not just for somebody to walk their dog down the street, but it's also because that's where school buses are. So there are challenges with sidewalks that aren't clear, and that's where major school buses are. School bus stops are. MCPS has shared some of those locations with us, and we're referring them to DHCA for priority in any enforcement actions DHCA is taking.
Thank you.
Thank you,
I just
Jeannie.
want to add, Jenny, I think it's for your benefit, and I think everyone's benefit. Some of these response decisions are trade-offs. And for example, we extended the period during which we allowed people to shovel their sidewalks because this particular precipitation was heavily ice and the temperatures were so cold, we were giving a bit of grace on the regulation to clear sidewalks because we were hearing concerns from people saying that they were having a very difficult time in achieving a clear sidewalk. And we understood that. But obviously, in doing so, that presents a challenge for MCPS's walkers in their safe routes to school to get back open and operating. And so these are difficult choices that we often have to make, and they have implications. There's no perfect solutions to some of these problems. Where, when we're pushing snow out of a street, we're pushing it inherently onto a sidewalk or onto a potentially a bus stop. And I think we have to balance out getting roadways passable without going too far to go curb to curb and put more snow up on the banks. And these are difficult challenges both for sidewalks and driveways and all the things that we've heard about. And so I think we have an impending conversation with the school system. That it's a normal meeting we have with them, and I think obviously at that we'll be talking about this situation and sort of expectations moving forward. Because I think obviously anyone who's been a parent in Montgomery County has recognized that the school system's expectations around weather have evolved over the last 20 years, and there are events that they would have opened for 20 years ago that they're no longer opening for. And obviously, obviously that's certainly their decision, but at the same time, and I understand why they make decisions. I'm a parent, I have a high schooler and a middle schooler, so I certainly understand and support their want to have things be safe. But I think, as Director Conklin alluded to, sometimes these are there are implications for expectations that shift if those expectations are not, well communicated in advance of them shifting. I think that's where we need to get on the same page with MCPS, is around the expectations of their what they have for our streets, and particularly the sidewalks around schools with regard to when they're going to operate or not.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I just want to just add to that. I mean, I think we have a responsibility, even in telling people they need to shovel their walks, to be a little bit sensitive to the health issues. When the temperatures were in single digits and people were dealing with wind chill factors that can cause frostbite in a very short period of time, ordering everybody out to do their sidewalks could have resulted in some really challenging health situations for people. We don't separate who has to clear their sidewalk. And if we had been truly hardcore about this from day one, I worry about what could have happened to individuals who would have gone out there, discovered that what they usually did in 15 minutes or 20 minutes was taking them hours, and they're doing this in temperatures that are just absolutely unbearable. I think we have a responsibility a little bit to think about, what are we really asking people to do, and do we really want to endanger people's health in a situation like that? So I was, kind of constantly aware of, do I order people to do this and then wind up with people who aren't able to cope with the temperature and the prolonged period of shoveling? I just think it's something we got to think about, because, I get the challenge of kids walking to school, but I picture some folks that I can think of out there trying to shovel, and I would worry about their health.
Thank you, Jeannie. You done with your questions?
I'm good. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I guess it's Tom Rusi, ABC7. Hi, Tom. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thanks for doing this. My question for whoever wants to take it is, can anyone give a time frame for when things will be at least reasonably normal? I mean, I know there's been a lot of improvement over the last couple of days, but as far as, there's still a lot of, say, turn lanes missing. There's still a lot, as you mentioned, sidewalks, crosswalks, not back to normal. How long will it take to kind of fully recover and move around normally in the county?
I can take a stab because we've talked about that a lot. We are unable to give a firm answer for that because it depends on what happens from here in terms of weather. If we had had an inch of snow last night, we would have had a big setback. That didn't happen. So we're continuing to make progress, but we are looking still at very cold weather through the weekend. So we're going to see improvement through this week. And then when the temperature drops again, that improvement will slow. And a lot of the issues that people are talking about are the larger state highway issues. They are moving through that network, and it's hard for them too, just like it is for us. When we To go back to the schools discussion, we got a list of state highway related issues that were affecting schools. They brought in crews from other districts to help us get those issues addressed. But those crews went back to where they were working because the same issues that are here are there. So, Tom, I wish I could tell you that in another 3 days, everything would be open and just like it was, but that's probably not going to be the case. And it's probably, we'll just continue to work at it and hope that the weather cooperates so that the progress is linear and we don't backslide.
Next week, we get into the 40s. That should clear some of this out.
Tom, you have additional questions, Tom?
Yeah, just wanted to ask too. I know, Chris, you said that on certain areas, concentrating on, say, crosswalks and sidewalks that you, the county, maintain. Is there any particular areas you're concentrating on the most, like, say, near public transportation, like bus stops, like you mentioned, or major intersections? What are you concentrating on the most?
Yeah, those crosswalks and ramps are at major intersections. Most of the time, they are actually either major county arterial to state highway intersections or state highway to state highway intersections. On those major corridors, the county clears those ramps and crosswalks, even though the state is clearing the snow off the road. Our crew today is down near the University Boulevard, Piney Branch, and New Hampshire Avenue area, working on clearing in those areas. We are trying to focus these activities where transit ridership is the highest, the housing density is the highest, and the school walking zones are most prevalent. Of course, we talk about school walking zones, that's most of the county, but there are certain areas of the county where there are a higher proportion of kids walking to schools than others.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Members of the media, do you have any additional questions for the county executive and county officials regarding snow operations? Please raise your hands. No more questions on this topic? Thank you, Chris. Mr. County
Thank you, Chris. Yep. Thank you, Crystal. I really appreciate your update, and we'll have more discussions about this, no doubt.
Yeah, thank you.
So last night, we had a forum about data centers, and I'm sure there'll be questions about this. Drew more than 100 people. They showed up in person, others were online, and they were there with a purpose. We want to ensure that lessons learned from previous studies and openings elsewhere are applied here in the state of Maryland and in Montgomery County. And so my team and I have developed a list of recommendations that we were able to share with the public to gather feedback and share with the county council as it develops legislation. So there's a proposal for legislation, which we know needs to go forward. We want to make sure that we are gathering information from the public and public input on how they feel about the data centers. There's really clear, I think one of the clearest messages I got out of that is something I fully agree with, is there's no way in hell that the public should pay for the electricity that is needed by the data centers. The construction of those power plants and production of and the construction of lines sufficient to carry that electricity needs to be borne wholly and completely by the data centers. They are driving up the cost of electricity. We all know this. Nobody denies that that's what's happening. And the more data centers we have without increases in supply, the more this is going to be a problem. And we can't be forced into a situation where people say, well, if you want supply, you're going to have to deal with dirty coal power plants. That's just not the way this thing should play out. And it's not the way I hope we're going to allow it to play out in Montgomery County. I hope there's a serious effort in the legislation to ensure that we do this right. Data centers, I actually believe, can be done right. I believe it's possible to deal with emissions. It's possible to deal with water. I know water is going to be one of the big issues, particularly on the facility where they plan on drawing water out of the Potomac River. It is an absolute requirement that water go back to the river, no worse condition than it was when it came out of the river, and it goes back at the same temperature that it came out of the river. That to me is like a no-brainer that we can require as we go down this road. So I expect the county to lay down some ground rules by the end of spring to prepare for the next step. Even if it's not 100% comprehensive, I do think that if the council does not feel they can get All this done in a reasonably short period of time that we need to put a moratorium, even if it, I think, as little as 6 months, possibly a little bit less, is feasible, but that requires putting together legislation that's comprehensive and effective. I don't want to see legislation that is done really quickly with a few things that are easy to agree on and that leave, larger issues untouched. So if the council can work on that while we're in the process of doing a budget, that would be good. And I think it's worth the effort to get this right. I think, in fact, it actually has to be gotten right. None of us are going to want to be responsible for people's further skyrocketing electrical prices. And unless we deal with the power issue, that's what we're going to be responsible for. So I feel pretty strongly about the ability to do this and do it right. I'm willing to do a moratorium of up to 6 months if that needs to be done in order to buy the time for the council. What I would hate to see happen is a proposal come in and get to the stage of approval where the argument will be you can't add new requirements to us after we've already addressed the existing requirements, because there are no existing requirements. No setback requirements, no water requirements, no energy requirements, none of that. So if somebody comes in and tries to lock in an approval before we put anything in place, I think that would be a mistake for us to let that happen. So the council is going to have to evaluate whether they want the time to do this right, or are they willing to risk something coming in and trying to gobble up an approval before we get legislation passed. I do think it's important that, other jurisdictions, have put in place setbacks, for example, as few as 100 feet, which I think is inadequate, to 300 or 400 feet, which makes more sense. I think one of the drafts would confine data centers to industrial zones. That would be a big step. So that I think there are possibilities. And here's some of the things that, we all need to think about aside from the big one I talked about. Like I said, needs to be intended for industrial use. We have to restrict the use of diesel generators. They are dirty. And if they're there only for emergency, we've got to be sure that it's only a short-term emergency. I think there's a real preference for battery storage, and battery storage can be created. Most of these places, for example, the one in Dickerson is on a major power line. Batteries could be charged off the grid and stored, and the energy stored for when they need it. I think approving diesel generators should be on the list of last things that we allow. We have to develop, stormwater management requirements. These are large impervious surfaces. There's going to be a lot of water that's never going to see the ground until it runs off these buildings. And we've got to figure out how we're going to deal with this. We've got to have buffer areas for noise, which means we're going to have to revisit the noise ordinance to ensure the data centers comply with what's acceptable. And like I said, the mandate that the water goes back to the watersheds in the same temperature it came out. Some people, said, why are we even bothering to go down this road? Particularly because of the frustration that these data centers have brought to other communities. I'll just say that it is true that the data centers can be real aggravations to people. They've gone up in Virginia without the kind of protections for communities that I think that we would expect to put in place here. I know that, Virginia's rethinking how they do things. Because there's not been a lot of public joy over the nature of data centers there. On the other hand, the data centers can provide substantial amounts of revenues, and there are a lot of residents last night who said did not want us to subsidize data centers. There is no reason for us to subsidize data centers if the whole purpose of bringing them in here is that they're major revenue generators, and we're doing all this other stuff to ensure that there's a way to locate them safely. If they're not going to generate revenues, then there's no reason to have the data centers here, because they're just going to eat up our capacity and create problems for everybody and drive up everyone's electric bills. So there are ways to do this. I still believe there are ways to do this, but I think residents raised a lot of legitimate concerns. And I've seen answers to a lot of their concerns. Last night wasn't the time to talk about that, but I do think there are ways to manage many of the problems that have come with other data centers. So looking forward to what the council wants to do, but my inclination is to try to buy time with a moratorium so the work can be done without having to be under a rush of trying to beat the first data center into the approval process. Other news, I was really disappointed by Tuesday's decision by the majority of the county council not to adopt my recommendation and create a higher debt limit ceiling for capital expenditures in the near future. I will continue to argue for restoring the purchasing power that the county lost following the 2009 recession. I'll say this again, what we're doing makes no sense on capital projects. In 2009, we were bonding $300 million a year. And most of what we were bonding for in the school system was new construction to address capacity. Today, under the council's proposal, we would be bonding $300 million a year, the same as we were doing in 2009. There is no way that school repairs and school construction match the prices of 2009. We will probably do half the work for the same amount of money. And the amount of work that needs to be done in the schools is serious. And before people point fingers at the schools and say, how did you let this happen? They let it happen because they could look at the county budgets and see pretty clearly that if they asked for school capacity projects, there wasn't anything left in our bonding limits to do a substantial amount of repairs and renovations, which they needed. So they deferred the renovations and focused on expansion of capacity. Fortunately, depending on how you look at it, because of declining enrollment, we've got the luxury now of not having to deal as much of the capacity, and we can focus on repairs. But the repair backlog is north of $2 billion. Even the school superintendent acknowledged this is not something that's going to be fixed in 1 year or 6 years. My budget made no effort to solve the problem in 6 years because it would not be possible for us to do that. But we need to do something about our ability to bond. Even when I was on the council 14 years ago, 10 years ago, we were bonding at $340 million a year. It got dropped to 280. We've been staying at 280 until this year where they're going up to 300 is absolutely inadequate for the problem that we're facing. I appreciate the fact that the school system's finally being honest about its needs. It may not be convenient for us, but it's at least honest. And the best way to support the improvements is to put this money into the budget. I'll point out, I was listening to Jessica Fitzwater, who's the county executive in Frederick County, and she talked about how a couple of years ago, in the face of serious needs from their school system, she raised the tax rate 5 cents in order to address the capital needs of the schools there. That's what it looks like when you're taking this problem seriously and putting the money where it's needed. For people who say, we've got to live within our means, and if we raise our taxes at all, then we won't be competitive. I'm going to run through these numbers one more time. Frederick County's property tax rate is $1.11. Howard County's property tax rate's either $1.33 or $1.34. Prince George's County, $1.37. Fairfax County, $1.15 for residents, $1.28 for commercial property everywhere. And then an additional tax going up to $1.50 almost in Tyson's and Reston if you're in the special taxing districts. So the jurisdictions around us all have higher tax rates on residents except for one district, and that would be the District of Columbia. And DC has a lower tax rate. Just DC residents only pay 85 cents on the tax rate. And that sounds like it's, definitely lower than we are. But the reason DC can pay 85 cents on the tax rate is that their tax rate on commercial property, if commercial property is worth $10 million, which is almost everything in DC, the tax rate is $1.89. If property is worth between $5 and $10 million, property taxes are $1.77. And if your property is worth $2 to $5 million, their tax rate is $1.66. So all we've got to do is look around us and see where other jurisdictions are taxed and stop telling people that we're a high tax jurisdiction because we're not. Stop telling people that we won't be competitive if we raise our tax rate, because everybody else's rates are higher than ours, except for DC. And if the council ever wanted to go in the direction of DC, that would be very interesting. But there's a way to deal with this, and we've got a responsibility to deal with this. I shudder to think what's going to happen with these schools. You're talking about air conditioning systems not working. You're talking about schools that have, major chronic disinvestment or underinvestment. And it's just not the right thing to do. I recommended issuing $340 million in bonds in 27. It's an increase, amounts to about, then we would add that 10 million to that for each year after next year, going up to $390 million by FY32. That actually keeps us in line with our debt service targets. It would take us over 6 years to 10.3 instead of 10.1. We've been a lot higher than 10.3 in our history. We've brought our bonding rate below that now. We could bring it back up about to the same number, and we'd still meet our targets, and we'd be able to build the things we need in this county. This is the first time in 15 years the county's debt service to the general fund ratio has fallen under the self-imposed 10% policy guideline. Again, first time in 10 years. So we've done a lot of work to get ourselves where we belong. We can stay where we belong, but we've got to get serious about building the things in this county that residents expect. So I hope the council will think about this a little bit more. We'll look around at the jurisdictions around us, realize that we are not the high tax jurisdiction in the region, realize that we can do this without compromising our AAA credit rating, and our regional competitiveness, which relies on our stellar school system, is going to be more at risk by letting the schools deteriorate than it's going to be by having to deal with the small tax increase, if that's what it comes down to. We have a crown jewel of a school system, but it's aging, and it's time to consider how much we stand by the school system or how much we're willing to risk losing by not making the proper commitment to the education in this county. I want to thank our county employees and community partners who are going to be out tonight and early tomorrow morning conducting our annual homeless point-in-time count. There's a legal requirement to qualify for federal funding. And on that note, I want to thank Congress for extending the continuum of care funding for another year. The money is essential to our permanent supportive housing program, which they tried to kill. I'm really happy about that because that would have put 500 families on the street pretty quickly. And it helps keep hundreds of people housed with important support services. The point-in-time count is also an opportunity to better understand how homelessness in the county affects residents across Montgomery County. And after a week's delay due to the bitterly cold temperatures, volunteers are going to fan out across the county to count both the people they find living outside and conduct a brief survey. The face-to-face interaction gives us an opportunity to share essentials with them and connect those experiencing homelessness with resources that could help them regain stability in their lives. We make overflow shelter space available for individuals and families. We served 500 people with space indoors and out of the elements, and that's on top of our more than 400 beds that we normally have open. Our community partners like the Coalition for the Homeless and Interfaith Works, Rainbow Place, and the Salvation Army were essential in helping to keep everyone fed. And thanks to the American Red Cross for providing cots, and our shelter partners like Interfaith Works for showing immense patience during very, very trying times. If we're truly going to treat everyone in our county equally, then we have to show some compassion and be here for everyone. Some people criticize this approach, but in Montgomery County, everyone is treated with respect. The government will continue to help individuals and families made homeless and make that homeless experience a one-time and as brief an occurrence as possible through the strong social support network that we have here. This work is really important. I think I mentioned this before, and I was in Los Angeles recently. It is really disturbing to see what happens when homelessness is not treated, but homelessness is just allowed on the streets and people just live their misery out in the public. And it is hard to deal with, hard to cope with sometimes. And one of the things about the work we do and the shelters we create and the spaces we create is we prevent a lot of this, not all of it, but a lot of it from spilling over into the community. And I'm just grateful to nonprofit partners who work with us. The county couldn't do it by itself, but everybody doing this together, I think, makes a difference in this county. And we're going to continue doing that work. And with that, I'll turn it over to my team for any other comments, updates they have, and then we'll go to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. County Executive, for those numbers and information. I also like to echo those sentiments. It took our entire community and our partner agencies with the Department of Health and Human Services to get 42 individuals in a humanitarian effort out of the cold, extreme weathers, to where it was safe in a warm space. Many of these individuals had co-occurring disorders, mental health challenges, chronic medical challenges as well, concerns, and they refused shelter. But we were able to transport folks out of the cold and into a warming center over 10 days. And so that was a significant accomplishment to keep 42 people safe and out of harm's way. So I just wanted to repeat that because that is a highlight that I think all should recognize. I'll stop there and I'll turn it over to Sean O'Donnell for any public health updates that he has this afternoon.
Thank you, sir. On that topic, just want to remind folks that if you have neighbors, friends, family members who live alone, we still are in the midst of this cold spell. It still can be dangerous. Please check in on them. Things that we suggest doing, making sure that they have their heat is working. They've got their temperature, their thermostat set above 55. I know the power bills are very expensive right now, but now is not the time to turn that thermostat down below 55. That's very dangerous. We do see from cold-related deaths that our residents who are 65 and older are about twice as likely to be in that number. So we do suggest you check in on them. They're more likely to have difficulty with doors that could be jammed or frozen shut, falls and other things that can put them at risk when they go outside. So just a reminder for that. With relation to those respiratory diseases that we monitor and we share with you all, the good news is our hospital visits, our inpatients for the three major ones, COVID, flu, and RSV, are all receding at this point. There's still RSV going on out there. There's still some COVID going on out there, but those numbers are coming down, and that's good news. Just a reminder to folks that if you have health insurance, you've already paid for those flu shots, those COVID shots. You've already paid for it. Make sure you go and get them from one of the places that honors your insurance. And that's all we have for you today.
Thank you, gentlemen. Members of the media, we're going to open it up for general questions now. I see Jack Hogan has the hand up and the camera on, the banner. Good afternoon, Jack. Good
afternoon. Question for the county executive on the data center moratorium. Yeah. What exactly would this mean? Like, what specifically would be paused?
The sole purpose is to not approve anything during the time that people are drawing up guidelines. You don't want to be in a position where somebody goes through a process here, right? Goes all the way through, gets all the approvals, and then somebody says, "Oh, you can't do this because we just changed the regulations." There's nothing that says don't ever come here again. Than putting somebody through a process and then saying we just changed everything. I agree with that we need to change things. So we just thought to pause it so that, nobody comes in and then discovers that we've changed things and gets upset. This way they get to participate in the process. We'll hear what their concerns are, but I think it's important to make sure we don't wind up with things approved that we don't want approved because they're not under conditions that we think are important to have. Unless the council thinks they can get it done really, really quickly and comprehensively and with community input, I think it's going to be very hard to get that done in a month or two, particularly when they're trying to do the budget. 6 months would be plenty of time to get this done, maybe 4.
And would this be like an executive order? And would
No, I can't do an executive order. I mean, so anything I did, I'd have to send over proposed legislation. The council would have to pass it. I know there's some people apparently don't want to do a moratorium. So I want to hear how they're going to deal with making sure this, if they don't do a moratorium, then nothing happens that we can't undo if we need to undo it. Our residents will be really angry with us if things get approved that we otherwise would have legislated over, but didn't because we didn't take the time to do it. So I just try to guarantee we get it done right. It's still it's the council bill that'll come out. So I'm not trying to, we'll participate like they will in shaping it. But the big thing is just not get ourselves in a problem we don't want to be in.
I've got a few more, but I'll let Shaylee go.
Thank you.
Hi, my question is also for the county executive, but this is about the bond limiting.
Yeah.
You mentioned County Executive Fitzwater in Frederick County and her dedicated tax for school construction. Would you consider something like that now that you know that the bond limits are not going to be what you had hoped?
Yeah. I mean, it's, what she did up there, it's dedicated. We have the ability to dedicate funding for schools and we could fund it for construction. We know that their ask, I mean, it was a multi-year ask, and I didn't even go as far as the school system wanted me to go. I couldn't get to 960 million over the next 6 years. So our numbers, is a lower number. I'd be willing to lock that in as a minimum number. And at least people know the money's going to the schools and only to the schools, for that portion of the money, and it's not used for other things. But, even if we do that, we still have the issue of totally being unable to finance any transportation in this county, which is why, we've been pushing, at least from my administration, to have the authority to have special taxing districts on commercial property so we can do what Virginia does. They don't finance this stuff on the backs of their residents. They finance it on development. And so if this is the place everybody envies, we ought to start looking at what they do in the place that we envy and try to emulate it rather than pretend like it's not there.
Thank you. Members of the media. Oh, I see Judy Hurst has her hand up. The Greater Only News. Good afternoon, Judy.
Thank you. I want to go back to data centers for just a moment. Mr. County Executive, what would the logic be in moving swiftly for these data centers? I mean, what would be the problem with waiting 6 months to get everything in place?
I don't know. I mean, I think, the potential, owner of the data center and, owner of the property, they know this is being discussed. And I think they certainly should have gotten the sense from people that for the most part, people believe there's a way to do this. Even I believe there's a way to do it and do it in a way that's responsible. So I don't know why they wouldn't wait for that. And I don't know why they would want to start down a process, spend that much money on design or things that at the end of the day, if we wind up passing regulations that are enforceable, they would then have to change the work they did. So I think, it's fair to everybody to know what's the end game going to be. So whatever you design fits the end game. Nothing I've heard people recommend, none of the things that, people have proposed doing are things that aren't being done at other data centers all around the country. So we're talking about just grabbing the best practices from places that are tackling the same issues we're tackling, doing it in a responsible way, and everybody, I think, winds up whole out of the deal.
Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Jack, I see your hands up again.
Yeah. On the moratorium specifically, is your understanding, County Executive, that this would impact the Dickerson project?
It would, yes. Dickerson's not at the point that it's gone through permitting. It may have an approval from zoning, but that's not the same thing as having a shovel in the ground and having your thing permitted. And that's the important thing. Park and planning isn't going to legislate on, do you have diesel generators or gas generators? I mean, those are issues that you put into your building code. And so the developer knows that these are the things you have to do when you build, sort of like our fire code. All the regulations that you have to meet when you're building, this would just be regulations specific to building a data center. And they really belong in the code. And if the view is that it's done when it got through park and planning, then we would have no power at all, which would be a very bad thing.
Yeah, park and plan would have to stop any approval process that Atmosphere and Terra and the applicants might be going through at this.
I think they've already I think they've already got their approval from Park and Planning. Their next step would be to submit a plan to permitting saying this is what we're going to build. So if they submit a plan without bringing their own power, if they submit a plan without a way to return the water to the river at a certain temperature, without our having those requirements, it gets hard to enforce.
Got it. And under your moratorium, any decision on the permit, regardless of what their application includes, wouldn't happen for 6 months.
Right, but they could certainly. You could look at the process as it evolved and figure out pretty quickly what's going to be in the legislation, and make sure you start building that into your plans. I mean, in a perfect world where somebody's paying attention and not trying to obstruct or wish for a different outcome, if they pay enough attention, they should be able to figure out what's going to be in the bill and start their design accordingly. Hopefully not fight the bill.
I've taken up a lot of time. I have one more, but I'll let
Yeah.
Suzanne. I don't want to hog up.
Thank you, Jack. I see Suzanne Pollock has her hand.
Mine is on a different subject, so if you wanted to continue.
Okay. Yeah. I guess real quickly, County Executive, what your timeline for introducing this proposal?
I'm going to have a couple conversations with people on the council and see whether, because they'd have to pass it, and see whether they think they can do this without passing, any kind of moratorium. I mean, my question to them is, are you sure you can get a bill together that's comprehensive in a reasonable time frame? I don't want them rushing to do something so they don't irritate the potential developer and wind up not doing it thoroughly and getting the protections we need.
So how likely would you say you are to introduce this? How would you characterize that?
Well, it depends on what kind of reception I get over there.
Got it. Okay.
Thank you, Jack. Go ahead, Suzanne.
I was just curious. I know we keep record, or the county keeps records on how many people with respiratory viruses and stuff are in the hospital. Have we any numbers on how many people went to the emergency room because of slipping on the ice, breaking bones, or getting heart attacks from shoveling, that kind of stuff? Do we know that kind of stuff?
I honestly don't know that. I don't know if anybody in my health team would have that information.
So I don't think we have that breakdown. That's it can be a pretty broad range of things that would be classified by that, and that might be difficult to pull that specific statistics.
All right, thanks.
Suzanne, the only thing I would add is that if it's an individual or a number fewer than 10, we may not be able to disclose that due to protected health information, which would identify individuals. But if it was a greater risk or a community level risk, then that's when Sean and our public health team would get additional information.
Got it.
All right, excellent. Members of the media, any additional questions this afternoon for the county executive and county officials? No more questions? Well, thanks everyone for joining us this afternoon. Stay safe, and we'll see you next time. Have a great afternoon.